and welcome to Into the Fold, a Book and Lit Fest podcast with Jael and Lin. I'm one of your hosts. My name is Jael Richardson. I'm the founder and executive director of the Festival of Literary Diversity, or FOLD, hence the name, Into the Fold.
Into the Fold, yes. I am your other host. My name is Hudson Lin. I am the program coordinator for the FOLD.
So this episode is sponsored by Sheridan's Honors Bachelor of Creative Writing and Publishing program, a 4-year degree that prepares students for a career in both writing and publishing. Visit sheridancollege.ca for more information. All right. Well, with all of that, let's get into the fold. I want to start by talking about the title, because we came up with Into the Fold after a number of conversations
Lots
about this.
of conversations.
And there was a little bit of debate. We were very rather interested in prepositions. we knew we wanted to include the fold in the title. We talked about beyond the fold, beneath the fold, below the fold. But we decided to go with into, which I know you like.
I like it because I came up with it.
And that's true. She did come up with it. It was a vote. I lost. No, it's fine. But we went with Into the Fold, and I do like it. It has grown on me in a way because I think the focus for the next few monthly-ish episodes that we're going to do, leading up to the 10th anniversary of the Festival of Literary Diversity, or FOLD, in Brampton, we're going to take you behind the scenes into kind of the planning and the deliberation that goes into the FOLD, some of the challenges with working on something like the fold. So I think Into fits really well.
Yeah. And I think in addition to the whole behind the scenes, we really like the idea of bringing people into the fold, of like bringing people into the community and that sense of belonging. Because I think that's a really big part of the fold is we want to create this environment where people feel like they're comfortable, it's safe, they belong. And so we want to foster belonging and bringing people into our community, into the things that we value, and all that good stuff.
I like that.
Yeah.
I like that. I think, it's funny, we started the fold about, I always get numbers like years. I know it's the 10th anniversary, but for me, I've actually been doing this, it feels like 12 years. I can't figure it all out. But I started this in 2014. I came up with the idea for FOLD because I love literary festivals. I know you do too. Been to a lot of them. And at the time that I was going to them, they weren't particularly diverse. There wasn't a lot of diversity on stage. There wasn't a lot of diversity in the audience. I had a few, I don't want to throw this word around loosely, but I had a few slightly traumatic situations at literary festivals where I was made to feel like I didn't belong, I wasn't meant to be there, or made to feel like if I'm going to be there, I better talk about being Black, that kind of thing. And so I think for me, starting the fold and then looking at this, we're 10 years in now, we've done, this will be our 10th festival that we're putting on. It's really exciting to hear you say the kind of community that we're trying to foster, that we try to foster, and what the podcast is meant to do in terms of talking about that and bringing people along with us.
Yeah. And so 10 years is a huge milestone. And the theme for our 10th year is a decade of change. And for you, what does that mean to you? What does that theme mean to you? I mean, you've not just with the fold, but you are an author yourself. You've been in the publishing industry. What does a decade of change mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think that what's interesting about the 10th is that it's the 10th. This is going to sound weird. It's the 10th from nothing, right? It's not just the 20th in which we're looking at the last 10 years or we're looking at the last 20. We started it from nothing. And now at 10, we can see if we've accomplished anything, right? There's this really before the fold and after the fold kind of situation,
the fold.
Right? More prepositions. I think for me, the idea of a decade of change is interesting because it's what have we done? What have we accomplished over the last 10 years? And I think it's both what FOLD has done and what have we accomplished, and also what's happening in the industry and what's been happening in the industry over the last 10 years. And the last 10 years have been a very strange 10 years, right? So strange.
So strange.
It's very hard actually to compute that it's been 10 years because of the pandemic in particular, because in some ways the festival started and had 4 years of like growth and like things were happening. And then our 5th year, chaos.
Right.
And 6th year, entirely virtual. And then coming back to doing what we now call like a multimodal festival where we do part virtual, part in person. It's been like starting from ground zero in a lot of ways. So on some level, we're planning and preparing and organizing for a 10th anniversary. But on another level, it feels like more like a 4th anniversary or a 5th anniversary, because I think in some ways, much like we were right before the pandemic, I just feel like we're getting into stride. You know, like we're just, this new version of Fold is just gaining momentum and is much younger than even 10 years.
Right.
So I think that's what's weird for me when we talk specifically about Fold on a decade of change scale.
Yeah.
I know for you, I mean, you were an author at the, what, 5th festival? Was it the like fully
It was the first virtual one.
The first, like, we knew it was going to be virtual.
Yeah.
the first like normal virtual.
No, I think it was.
Was it? No, I think it was. I think it was the first year we were in like our proper virtual platform.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah, I'm almost positive.
Okay. I actually went to the Fold before that in 2019 as just like an attendee, as a reader, because I like came across the Fold randomly, and I was like, oh, I was living in Mississauga at the time, so I was like, I'm going to drive up to Brampton and go to this thing, and it was great.
Oh, thanks.
I don't think I ever told you that before.
Yeah, no, I don't think you told me that before, but that's great to know. Well, I'm curious for you. You're a romance writer. When we talk about a decade of change too, I know you're really interested in like the industry as a whole, not just like genre and what you write, but you also do a lot of thinking about the ways people publish and how people come about their writing. And so for you, not having been thinking about the Fold for the last 10 years in the same way that I have, you know, what have the last 10 years in publishing been like for you?
Yeah, I think there's been so much change in the last 10 years. And at the same time, not enough change. I think when I first started getting into writing, Twitter was like the big thing. Everyone was on Twitter. And seeing the discussions on Twitter about the need for more diversity and the need to publish diverse books written by diverse authors, I think that was the first time I was like, oh, this is a space that I could fit into, that I'm really passionate about this topic, and I feel like I have something to contribute. And so it's been really nice to see over the course of, I guess, like 8 years or so, the number of authors of color, the number of queer authors, the number of disabled authors who are being published, both through traditional means, and it's great to see more of those people going through the traditional avenue, because there's a lot of gatekeeping in that area, but also through self-publishing and how many people have just been like, you know what, if I am being kept out of the traditional publishing space, I'm going to create my own path. I'm going to chart my own way. And the success that they've been able to find there as well, I think is a big deal. And I do think that publishing as an industry as a whole is in this moment of change. And it started with like ebooks and the advent of ebooks and people reading on their iPads and their phones and Kindles. And now there's like a resurgence of paperbacks and then like self-publishing versus traditional publishing. There's a lot of things going on at the moment, and we haven't quite settled into like the next phase of what the industry is going to look like yet, which I think is exciting, because then as the Fold, we can contribute to saying like, what do we think the industry should look like? And let's push toward that direction.
I like that. I love that you brought up too. I remember, so before I came into doing Fold, I was in an MFA program. So I got into writing I initially was in theater. I decided to go into writing. I decided, because I'm such like a school person, that the only way to finish a book was to enroll in a program in which you had to finish a book in order to graduate.
Right.
This was like a very helpful path for me. So I enrolled in an MFA program for creative writing. And I remember being in that program, and it was like the beginnings of ebooks. And there was all this like fear around like ebooks and like will people keep reading and how is it going to affect like how people read. And I wasn't in an MFA program at the time, but soon after that, audiobooks became like a big topic of conversation as well. And I think it's interesting when we think about a decade of change to remember those like evolutions as well. Like you said, that the industry itself is like shifting, much like in TV and film, there's streaming, there's all these things that are happening that affect how we watch things, how we consume things, that's happening in the book industry as well. I think one of the things I find frustrating about the book industry is I find they are a bit slow to like move with trends or to figure out how people are doing things and adjust. They've kind of been doing things the same way for a very long time. And some of the shifts are happening. My mom always says, I say this quote all the time, big ships turn slowly. And one of the great things about Fold is that we've been able to move quickly. We're new, we're small. We kind of like have been able to react to all these different moments in time, including the pandemic, a lot easier than than other places, especially in publishing where like they just don't know how to do things. Like they and they don't have the resources to shift quickly. And we think about when the pandemic happened, one of the big challenges was, people were so used to buying books in person at festivals, at bookstores. What does it look like to have an event and motivate people to buy online? What structures do you need to put in place that make people excited to press like, send me my book. And so I find that really interesting to think about in the industry as well. How do we get this industry that's a little bit like stiff sometimes and stuck sometimes to move quickly, to react quickly, to adapt to the way that people are consuming content?
Yeah. And I know we've had this conversation many times, but I am both traditionally published and self-published. And I am a huge proponent of self-publishing just because authors who are self-published can react quickly and they can see, oh, there's this new trend coming up. Let me jump on that. Let me get ahead of the trend. And I think a lot of marginalized authors have been able to capitalize on that mobility and that agility. So not to continue being a broken record.
But I also think one of the things with genre writers is there's a very different lens and focus. And I feel like I come from the like lit fic kind of snobby side of literature that's like...
You said that.
I said it. I said it myself. I admit it. I think it's because, especially doing an MFA, there's a lot of like traditionally publishing like approaches, a lot of focus even on awards and like that kind of award culture is how is what you want to aspire for. Like the idea of asking an author what success looks like and then accepting whatever answer they give is, in lit fic, it's like I make the art, I do the thing. Sometimes in poetry, it's like that too. And I'm like, no, how do we make money? Like, how do we make money as writers? I think genre fiction writers in general and self-published sometimes too are more attuned to that strategy about like, how do we make money? And I think it's good. And I think I like to think about that. I know I'm all for socialists, like social justice and doing all those sorts of things. But I always say I live on the border of socialism and capitalism. Like in order to do my socialist work, I've got to figure out how to make enough money to do it. Whatever that looks like. So I think that one of the things that's exciting when you think about a decade of change too, is to think about what people have done over these last 10 years that have been successful. I'm using air quotes because that looks different for different people. But I think there are authors who enter this industry and are like me. I would like to make money off my art in some way. I think for me, I ended up leaning more into commercial fiction in a way, like not putting so much pride in like that lit fic style where the writing is so beautiful and profound. I really was like, I'm just going to tell a story. And when I found out like just telling a story is actually commercially can be more lucrative, I was like, oh, great. It's in my wheelhouse. Like this is what I think I do best. And it's going to probably increase my chances at making enough money to make this worthwhile. Yes, please, more of the same. So I think that I wanted to have those kind of conversations. It was something, honestly, when I first started Fold that wasn't really happening in the circles that I was part of.
I do think that the whole money thing is something that, because there was the whole publishing paid me hashtag a couple of years ago, and it's kind of died down at the moment. But I think that is an important conversation that we need to have.
Yeah.
Because writers, there's this image of a struggling artist, but I don't believe that should be the case. Like writers and all artists should be paid for the work that they do. Because otherwise, like, it's like awards are great, but awards aren't going to put food on the table, right? And
some awards will put food on the table, but it's only going to put food on the table for one person.
Right.
To me, it's like playing the lottery, right?
Right?
You're putting your book in there and you're hoping that you're the one that gets the big cash prize.
Yeah.
And other people, you can get smaller amounts or whatever, but like really and truly, it's not your most likely path towards.
But it's not a sustainable thing, right?
No,
you might win the award once, but you're not going to win that award every single year.
Yeah.
And so similar to you, I've realized that telling the story is a really important part, and that's what readers want. They want the good story. Yeah. And so you can get really fancy with the writing. You can like spend hours deciding which word do I use in the sentence. But at the end of the day, I think as long as the story is there, that's what readers want, and that's what's going to drive sales. That's what's going to make the money, having the good story.
Love it. All right, so we're just getting warmed up. We're just getting started. I think one of the things we wanted to do with the podcast was to have a bit of a conversation where you get to know us, you get to know a little bit about Fold and about what we're doing, how we're planning. At this stage of planning, the theme is really all we have at this point. We're in the very early stages, but we will be sharing a little bit more about that as we go through the process. I think for this episode and for all the episodes, we want to make sure we bring in a guest as well. And so we're going to take this minute to bring in our first guest. And I think this is a chance to kind of open the conversation up a little bit wider, include somebody who's either from the team or from the wider publishing community in the conversation. And I think we're going to talk a little bit more about publishing, about this decade of change, and a little bit about how things have shifted for us. So we're excited to welcome our first guest on Into the Fold. Lynn and I are very excited about this. First guest is Ardo Omer. And I consider Ardo to be like the foremost expert in Canadian children's literature, especially when it comes to just knowing authors, illustrators, and storytellers from marginalized communities. I think she's been paying attention to this area, this particular portion of the publishing industry for a long time. And she's been paying attention to it with a particular lens and a particular wisdom that I rely on every day, pretty much. She serves at the Fold as our kids program coordinator. And she was a part of the conversation about a decade of change. And so we're really excited to bring her into the Fold.
Welcome, Ardo.
Hello.
So let's start off with the decade of change, because like Jael said, you were part of the conversation to come up with a theme. What are your thoughts on the theme?
I think the theme makes a lot of sense in the context of why Fold was created in the first place, because it's a place to spotlight marginalized voices. So if that's the mission, it's good to reflect back to see how the publishing landscape has changed, how Fold has changed, and then also Fold's impact on the publishing landscape. It's interesting because also Fold was started as a result of that change as well. So like I was a book blogger when in 2014 there was the We Need Diverse Books movement that came out of like the controversy of yet again the Book Expo of America like not having any people of color or like just smatterings of people of color.
I think there was one.
I think it was
2014. There was one. Was an Asian author, if I recall correctly. And I just mentioned this because this was like a key moment for starting the Fold. They released the lineup and like people all over were like, what? How in the year of 2014 is this happening? And that's the first time I had ever paid attention to like a trending hashtag was We Need Diverse Books. And that's, what led to this.
Yeah. And I was a book blogger at the time and those conversations were happening. I was primarily I read diversely, but a lot of the communities I was in that really talked about diversity was in the young adult space. And so it was clear that it was a bubble that was ready to burst when that happened. And hearing that was the inspiration for Fold, I thought, oh, okay, that's amazing. That's great. And then I actually attended Fold in 2017. First year was 2016. I found myself at a festival before coming to Fold. And so just watching the Fold being one of many change makers in the space kind of try to use the momentum of people's discontent with what happened with We Need Diverse Books and then turning that into action. And I think with the 10th anniversary, 10th festival coming up, it made sense that that would be the focus.
You mentioned something interesting about young adults, and I have found that the young adult space seems to be just like a couple of steps ahead of adult publishing, where things like diversity and We Need Diverse Books is mostly a kidlit type of movement, right? And so why do you think that like kidlit and young adult are more open to like different kinds of books and like pushing the envelope more so than adult books have been?
So I think, so one of the things I think plays a role is that there's not a lot of the same boundaries in terms of genre, right? Like in the adult space, you have clearly like, this is the mystery space, this is the horror space, this is the romance space. But what's great about YA is that you'll have like romantasy, you'll have these a lot of genres interplaying within a book or within a space. So they're not as segregated spaces. You'll have these communities interacting with one another and also featured within a book. But at the same time, I think it has to do with the audience as well. It's I won't speak for the authors, but I also suspect for me, when I think about whether it's a writer or as a programmer, I'm programming for younger me. So I feel like these issues are issues that I want to fix for a generation of younger kids who can go to a bookshelf and be like, I see myself. That my story's not an exception, that I don't even exist, right? Because you look at also like surveys of the number of books published about Indigenous people or about, Black people and you look at the numbers and you're like, gosh, that's so minuscule. And I think with that space, it's just a combination of, it's a community that's already talking to each other. It's not segregated. And it's also a community that's writing for an impressionable age category that's also trying to figure out who they are in the world. Not just who they are, but also their place in the world and their role in the world. So I think that's also a factor.
I think too, to pick up on that, there's two things that are happening in that. I love what you said about the romantasy and the blurring. I think that there's a belief with young people that more things are possible. They're not going to be as like frightened if like a ghost pops out of a corner or if, you're on another planet. They're just sort of like, yeah, let's go, let's roll. And I think that there's a belief that adult readers are more defined and they're more restricted and they're more like, I don't want to read about ghosts or I don't want to read about another planet. And while that may or may not be true, I think it truly comes down to one of the biggest problems I have in publishing, which is the marketing and just the lack of innovation, the lack of knowledge, the lack of expertise, I feel like that goes into marketing. And I'm specifically talking about like the marketing that goes into the film world or the marketing that goes into an album. There are people who they study this, they're experts, they're figuring this out, they're adapting, they're evolving. And I feel like sometimes in publishing, that is not happening in the same way. There's not as much like researched innovation in terms of like what's working and what's not. And so we end up just doing the same things and thinking the same things about audiences that may not be true. Because the reality is, if in 2014, there was more diversity in young adult writing, and if that has progressively changed over the decade, then the readers who are coming out now are more, at the very least, more flexible readers. And even before then, if young adult was dealing with fantasy and romance and stuff, the stuff that should be coming out now for adults should be reflecting that, right? We should be in that space. And I think you see that a little bit, but there's a lack of like practical, researched savvy sometimes in publishing. I think the other thing is when you're, the reason I think young adult is able to adapt a little bit more quickly is because you're working with a fast moving audience, right? They are only reading young adults for 4 years or whatever, 6, 8 years. Whereas in the adult side, you're like, I'm appealing to anyone from 16, 20, all the way to whenever. And so there's, I think, like a little bit more flexibility because that audience is constantly changing. And there's a feeling that they're constantly changing faster in a way that, like, I feel like publicists of young adult fiction in particular are some of the most savvy in the publishing industry.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that's something we're going to talk about in our next episode. So stay tuned.
Yes.
But I do find that I've found a lot of adults who read YA.
Yeah.
And I wonder if it's because they're finding more diversity there and they're finding more stories that maybe they would have liked to read when they were younger, or books that just resonate better with them than the adult books that are available to them.
Well, I think too, there's often a critique of young adult fiction, I think, and you can talk more about this, Ardo, and middle grade as well. There's sort of this, what's the word? Like looking down on it. There's a snobbery about young adult and middle grade fiction that, you should only read it if you're a kid, and you should only read it if you're a teen. And I saw that with Gutter Child, which was my first novel, which had a young narrator, but mature themes. And so I had to make a decision about whether to publish it as a young adult title or as an adult title. And I went with adult title because I felt like the people who I wanted to read it wouldn't read it if it was labeled young adult. And that was a tricky choice. Ardo and I had a long conversation about whether it would have done better or would have done differently, performed differently in different spaces as a young adult title, which was a really fun conversation. But that's the thing. It's like you have to sort of figure out, who do you actually want to be reading the book? And if adults is how you picture it, like, you do have to kind of put it in that camp, because one of the decisions when you're trying to decide for those two things for anybody who's listening is, it really did, one of the biggest factors and probably the biggest reason why I went with an adult category is because when you go to the bookstore, if it's young adult, it's going to be in the young adult section of the bookstore. And I remember going to find a book by Nicola Yoon, who's a US author that I loved. And I went to find her book, and I was looking in the adult shelves because, it was a really popular, it was a best-selling title, and it wasn't there. And it's because it was in the young adult section. I still bought it, but I didn't actually know or think to go looking for it. And initially I just thought they didn't have it. So that was kind of my biggest reason for deciding that. But it's because that's kind of the things that you're dealing with when you're trying to make these decisions in publishing.
I think it's interesting what you said about who do you want the audience to be?
Yeah.
And that's something I found coming into the fold for a couple of months now, that we're very conscious of who do we want our audience to be, and how do we let that dictate how we program and then the decisions that we make. So can you guys talk a bit more about that over the last 10 years? What is the audience that you've been trying to draw into the fold, and how has that gone?
Well, first I want to address the why of it all, because people do
the YA of it all.
Because people do. It's fascinating because there's two ends of it, right? There's the one end where people look down on YA and middle grade titles. And to be honest, I think it's because people look down at children. People look down at children and youth and think they don't believe they add value for whatever reason, or that they serve a very particular purpose, but they're not taken seriously, which is incorrect. They are little human beings. They may not be geniuses because they just got here. But I do think they add obviously value to the world because they have a perspective, right? And the thing is, we've all been kids and we've all been teens. And I think it's funny because Julie Black was the one who represented The Marrow Thieves by Shuri Demeline on Canada Reads. And one of the critiques that the book got, which was a YA book about, it was like a dystopian book that was a take on like residential schools. And so and it was a very important book, and it ultimately did really well, even though it didn't win. But the critique was that it was for teens. And because it's for teens, it meant adults couldn't find value in the book. And the thing is, look, at the end of the day, a good book is a good book. There's not great YA and there's great YA in the same way that there's terrible adult and there's great adult. But I think it's important to also note, one, YA as a demo is marketing. It's a new thing. You've been reading YA books that are classics, right? The Outsiders, like all these other books that weren't designated YA that everyone had access to. Two, it's a perspective. So if your character is a teen, it's like fascinating with like the gutter child of it all, right? It's a book that both adults and teens could enjoy.
Yeah.
And the fact that whether or not it's defined as an adult or a YA determines how successful it is with a demo is wild, because teens will read up, but adults refuse to read down.
Well, and that's the thing that I think comes down to it. I remember Suvankam Thamavongsa, who her book won a very popular prize and did very well. One of the things she talked about was a short story collection, and she was talking about the fact that her language choice is intentionally simple. And I mean like the words she chooses, the concepts and the sentence structure are just impressive. But she intentionally chooses more simple language, and she loves the idea, and it became sort of an inspiration for me, of creating books where a young person is reading it and their grandparent is reading it and the generation in between is reading it, and where they can talk about it together. And I think that when people look down on young adult literature and the way young adult literature is written, I think they're missing the experience of reading collectively and reading together. And I think it's such a special thing. And as much as I love lit fiction, as much as I've grown up on lit fiction, the one challenge of literary fiction, like that more fancy writing, is it is only certain people can read it, will read it, can understand it. And so it becomes a different experience with reading. And I think we don't often talk about like sort of the collective experience of reading a book in the way that we collectively watch movies together or we collectively listen to the same music.
Yeah, I've read YA books. Listen, there's value in everything, right? There's like the fast-paced, very, cheesy, devour in one sitting book. But there are YA books that are the most beautiful thing I've ever read that could stand up to lit fiction, to be quite honest, that I think are even better than some lit fic. But it's funny because the other end of it, talking about audience, is you have adult readers of YA. And there have been conversations around some YA authors writing for the adults versus the teens, which can also be an issue. And it's not necessarily writing in a sense that's not accessible technically. It's more the emotion of it all, right? It's important to, if you're writing a teen character, you got to remain in the perspective of a teen character. Because I think that's the most interesting age, because you're so ambitious and you have such an infinite idea of what the world should look like, both in the teen space and the early adulthood space. And I think as an adult, I recommend go finding a YA book that is, highly recommended, that maybe that's in more of a genre that you like, and give it a try and see if you can find a book you really like, because it's so nice to be reminded of that, because as an adult, you can kind of sometimes be jaded. And it's just nice to see a young person go, it's me versus the system and I'm going to win. Yeah. And it's like, oh, so good. I love that. Good. But in terms of audiences.
Well, yeah. Lynn asked a question a few minutes ago that I have not forgotten. We have not answered the question. But I think this conversation, interestingly enough, about young adult also leads into audience and literary festival audiences. I actually think it's extremely relevant, because I think literary festivals are traditionally built for an older audience. I think even when we tend to do young adult events, we tend to build them in the same way we build adult events, and then just make them for 14-year-olds. And that's been, I'm really interested to hear what Ardo has to say about building kids events specifically. But I think with building adult events, and what I've seen in our audience is we have a really eclectic audience. There's a really big mix. There's some people, we've had people come from New Brunswick and England, and we don't have the biggest festival. It's not the most amount of people you'll ever find at a literary festival. But it's a group of people that come not just for the authors on stage, I think, but for the experience of being together and being together in their interest of books and caring about humanity. I think there's a real sort of political kind of social justice mindset when you come to FOLD events. We partner with another story bookshop for the Festival of Literary Diversity, and their whole mantra for the books that they carry in their store is social justice minded. And I think that that's where our strongest audience has always been. A lot of people are writers on their own that come to the festival for that kind of community, that kind of encouragement. I know I always say, if I'm having trouble with my writing, I go to a literary festival and the inspiration comes back. And so I think people come to FOLD for that. I think we have a much younger audience than most literary festivals. I remember in the early years, statistically speaking, our largest demographic was like the 30 to 45-year-old range, which is not typical of a literary festival. Most of them are like 40 to 60, 45 to 60. And so, yeah, our audience, I don't think it's changed dramatically over the last 10 years, but I think it's different from our peers. And I think people, another thing that tends to happen for our events is I think people recognize that when we do something wrong, which we've done many things wrong, hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about it on the podcast, that there's an opportunity to correct it, that there's an openness to like change and evolving and meeting the needs of our audience. I really want to build, like, that's the thing I'm probably most interested about. If you were to ask me like what I want the next 10 years to look like, I really want to focus in on our community and really build that. And I think we do that with our virtual as well. That's what's been really exciting is it's not just people who can geographically make it to Brampton. It's about people who can log in from their computers and have a very similar community experience through our virtual events and our after parties and our trivia times. Like I've really seen the audience grow as we've leaned into the element of community.
Yeah, I think community building is so important with the mission of FOLD. Because like that's the point, right? You want everyone to feel welcome. You don't want people to feel tokenized. You want everyone to feel like, one, anyone can be a writer. Two, anyone can be a reader, right? And I think, and not only that they're in conversation with us. Because ultimately, and I think that's what some organizations kind of lose sight of, we don't make the festival for ourselves. We make it for the community. We make it for the writers and we make it for the readers. And so their feedback is the most important. And I think a successful community is one that offers their criticism with grace or with compassion, knowing that it's like the criticism you give a friend is not the same as a stranger, right? The idea that you're kinder with your criticism with your friend because the assumption is this friend respects you, they respect your opinion, and therefore any issues you may bring up with them, they're also taking it in and truly considering it. And I'd like to think that the community and the audience we've built with both the Adult and Kids Festival is one that feels like they can come to us in earnestness and say, I think this can be better. I think that can be better. And for us in that same earnestness being transparent, going, we'd love to do this and we'll do it better. Or if we can't do it, really explaining why we can't do it. And a lot of it is money, to be quite honest. But let's be honest.
I'm so glad you said that because I was going to say,
a lot of the limitations are due to that. But we do, the decisions we make are not decisions that we just make for the sake of making it. And I think, and you'll probably talk about it in future episodes, the idea of, the other thing about FOLD is because we're so openly about community, because we're so openly about making things accessible and all of these things, it does also make it so that we are the ones likely to get criticism. That there are people who do not value these things, but don't get, because people expect them to not do the quote unquote right thing or take these considerations. But because we've been openly been about, we want to take these considerations, we want to be thoughtful, it also means that people come at us harder. People criticize us harder. And I'm not opposed to it, like we just discussed.
I am opposed to it. No, I'm just kidding. I mean, I will say
I'm not opposed to criticism as a general concept, but just how it's like interesting. So it's just us.
Well, I think
you know what I mean?
I think when you say when your mission is to care about people, and when your mission is that you are going to listen, I think you open yourselves up to the kind of to criticism from people who have not been listened to before.
Yes.
And I think the challenge has been recognizing that those people need to be listened to, but also understanding like what our actual limitations are and what listening isn't always agreeing.
Yes.
I think that's an important thing that I've learned over the last 10 years.
Listening is not always agreeing. And I think I will say what I like about the idea of this podcast is that people are just reminded that there are human beings behind this. And we're not only are we human beings that have capacities, but we're also a not-for-profit in the arts. Like this is as bad as it's gonna get. I mean, we are underdogs.
Yeah.
I think Global Mail had released an article, a very intense article a few months ago about the state of Canadian arts, the arts sector.
Yeah.
It's not good,
No.
especially in terms of the financial aspect of it. And so I always liked, I hope this podcast illuminates like the work that goes into it, and I hope that people, you deserve to be heard. Mm-hmm. Everyone deserves to have their voices heard, and I think it's just understanding that to go in with care. And I'm saying that as someone where I grew up. My formative years has been on Twitter.
Yeah.
So take it from someone where I know what it feels like to be so hurt by something, and you just want to, really let everyone know about it. But at the very least, in terms of the topic of audience, we have a really good audience. And I think they've been really instrumental in the decades of change. And I hope that the upcoming festival will I don't know, make them feel like they've been heard and they get a really fun experience out of it.
Mm-hmm. I think too, and I'm curious for you, Lin, to share a little bit about like how you see the audience, what you'd like to see happen, both having been an author at it, but also just knowing that's your job now. Yeah. But I think too, I just want to give a shout out to Brampton, where we're recording this podcast, where Fold was born and birthed. I think it's been an underrepresented city. I think it's got, in most places, a bad reputation or not the most ideal reputation. And yet it's been the place. I was born in Mississauga, and I have had my greatest moments of success in Brampton. I've had my greatest moments of flourishing in Brampton. And so I think whenever we do Fold, I really, I want that to be at the center too, in terms of like our audience. I would love to see Bramptonians out in droves at Fold sometime. I would love to see it be like the kind of thing where you just know, the first weekend in May, I'm going to be at the Fold, or the first weekend in May, like my partner is going to be at the Fold, because they are just, maybe you don't read, but they read, and they love books. And that's kind of a big focus for us. I love doing multimodal because it allows us to build virtual events that anybody can join in on, but it also allows us to think about, the Brampton audience specifically. What does it look like to put on events for them? I love Fold Kids Book Fest which is our sort of our kids event, call it Little Fold. I love doing that one because it's free and like you can really open it up to the community in a particular way. And so I would love to see both situations, just like an excitement from people who live in Brampton and a pride about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think like Brampton is part of this like the suburbs of Toronto, which like can kind of feel sterile sometimes. Like I'm thinking not just Brampton, but like Mississauga, Oakville, Burlington, like and all the way across to like Ajax and
Markham
would be like it just feels very like suburb, right? And I think we don't necessarily remember that there's a lot of diversity in these suburbs, and you don't have to be in downtown Toronto to find diversity. You don't have to be in like a super urban place, but in fact, like the diversity that I've seen in the suburbs is almost like deeper because that's where like the hearts of certain ethnic communities reside. And so and
also reside, but like on the same street, like in close collaboration. I always joke around, I used to coach my son's soccer team. Like I've been to all these different, there are all kinds of kids, all kinds of people everywhere you go, grocery store, everything. And I think one of the things with that too in the suburbs is we often don't think of them as places where the arts are created and cultivated. Yeah. We think of them as places where people are born and they play soccer and they, go to school. But like when they want art, they go to the city.
Right.
And so I think it's really exciting to think about all the things that have already been happening, but specifically over this last decade with Fold are happening in the suburbs from a creation standpoint, like built, born, raised in the suburbs. We need that on a t-shirt. That art is being created in these suburbs. And I think that's true of Mississauga. It's true of Oakville. It's true of Burlington, Caledon, York region. All these places, art is being created, but it's often like minimized or in the shadow of like the big city.
Even in, I'm biased, not biased. I love Brampton. I grew up in Toronto and currently live in Toronto, but I live in like the suburbs of North York, right? Like, and it's fascinating because a lot of like arts organizations or like festivals and stuff take place in the downtown core. But like the very far east or the very far west or like especially the north doesn't get a lot of access to that, especially. But those are like, you get so many, you have so many like racialized groups that live there as well. And I think part of like, speaking of FOLD kids, for me, kids program was so important for me because I went to a school where I didn't have access to authors. Like I didn't think, it wasn't until high school when I read Monster by Walter Dean Myers that I thought, wait, can I be a writer? Like it's for those kids who don't, like, I think the thing about Brampton that's a fact that always I just think is completely wild is the access to bookstores. And like you have the Brampton Indigo chapters and then an Afrocentric, Knowledge and Afrocentric bookstore. And like that's pretty much it.
That's it for a city of almost 1 million people.
And I think that's
wild.
That is incredible. Yeah. And I will say, even as a Toronto person in the suburbs, I still got access to books. You know what I mean? Like bookstores and stuff. So I think having a space like FOLD is so important. And there's also a ton of other Brampton organizations and arts organization really trying to push more of that into Brampton, because you have a fertile ground of like young readers. Like that's the thing. Like books are so transformative. And to have that one book that makes you like, whoa, and like really, fill your imagination is so exciting. But yeah, you did ask Lin.
I did ask. You did share.
Your
she did share
as an author versus programming. Of do you find, like, what's your experience like? I'm just nosy because Lin's relatively new, and I want to gather some data.
Experience as an author versus as a programmer.
Yeah, because you've seen,
like, what would you want to see happen now that you're on the programming side that maybe either as an author you haven't seen at other places or
So I have made like a very small circuit of literary festivals in September as sort of like a fact-finding mission to like figure out what other festivals are doing. And I saw like the same roster of authors again and again and again and again and again. And there were some authors from marginalized backgrounds, but it was like the same 5, 10 authors. And this idea of like, there can only be one. There can be the one Black author writing sci-fi, and that person gets shopped around everywhere. Where in reality, there's plenty of Black authors writing sci-fi. Why do we only talk about the one, right? And so I would like to bring that understanding to programming and saying like, hey, if we want to talk about Black authors writing sci-fi, let's see what the whole like depth of that pool looks like. And maybe we can invite more than just that one person and see what other people, because it's like that one person cannot be the representative for the entire community, right? Like no one community is a monolith. There's differences, and people within the same community who have maybe similar backgrounds and similar experiences will disagree on some very fundamental things. So when we're talking about diversity, let's pick apart what that means. Okay. And on the surface, you may seem like similar people, but actually there's diversity in that even.
Yeah. Well, I think it's been lovely having you, Ardo.
Thank you.
Great first guest. I think before we wrap up, we have something really fun that we want to do with you. You talked a little bit about books that impacted you. You mentioned a book that particularly impacted you, but we have a little fun game that we like to do to wrap up each episode.
Yep. It's called Top Shelf, and it is about books, not about alcohol, just in case.
Top Shelf is related to alcohol?
You didn't know this?
No. I mean, I should say, I don't know if the podcast is a place to admit this. I drink certain things, but not others. I'm not like a big drinker. People bring wine to my house. I have no idea what it might mean.
I don't drink at all.
Neither do I.
But
And
I
knew
have
about
never
that.
heard this top shelf.
I've seen it in television shows. That's where I get all my knowledge.
Same.
My very
So
limited
I'm the
knowledge.
drinker on the panel, and I don't know what top shelf is.
But like the alcohol is kept on the top shelf at like the bar or the clubs because that's like the expensive stuff, the good stuff is kept up there.
yeah.
Because generally you would serve like the mediocre stuff on a regular basis, but like the special stuff gets
all right.
only take it
So
down.
top shelf.
All right, so top shelf are the 3 books that you think have made a big impact over the last decade, or just 3 books that you feel like you want to recommend?
Okay, whenever you ask someone who reads to pick like 3 books, you're like, okay, and then you throw in impacts impacts. So I decided to do kind of a combo of things that were impactful but also meaningful to me. And in true kidlit tradition, these are all YA titles.
Yay! Fits in with the topic.
Yeah, I'm like, as the kids person, I feel like I have to represent kids titles.
Of course.
So they're kids titles at Full Kids Book Fest, and also for all the kids programming and resources, we focus on Canadian. So that's what I've done as well.
Ooh. We love Canadian.
Gotta
You're
highlight our
staying on
Canadians.
brand.
Yeah.
On brand.
Right, yeah.
The first book is actually S.K. Ali's first book, and actually all of these books are the first books of the authors I'll mention. Saints and Misfits.
Ugh, such a good one.
It was the first book.
I shouldn't say that because then if I can't say it for the rest of them, it's going to be like, did you read that one? Sorry. Shout out to SK.
It is the first book by a Muslim woman, especially a visibly Muslim woman. She wears a hijab, that was being published, and not just published, but specifically it was the first title, the first YA by Salam Reads, which is the Simon & Schuster America's imprint. That was dedicated to publishing children's literature by Muslim authors. And it was so impactful because it's about the inspiration is Flannery O'Connor, an author, and like that kind of vibe of books, coming of age. But the teen is a teen Muslim girl, hijabi, who experienced a not so great thing at the hands of a leader of the mosque, or someone who holds a important position in the mosque. It's been a while since I've read this book. And just her experiencing teen things, but also grappling with this very, traumatic thing and trying to find her voice, very on brand with YA. And it was so impactful because when she's a Muslim woman writing this and getting so much promotion and support from a big top 5 publisher, but also she tackled a topic that is not usually discussed among Muslims so publicly, which is interesting because it doesn't matter what you believe or what religion you are. Human beings are human beings, and you're always going to find people who will abuse power. And so I think it's very important, again, going back to readers, it's important for kids to understand that what's wrong is wrong, regardless of what your community is. So that's that.
Book 1. Book 2.
Book 2, The Silence of Bones by June Her. It came out in 2020, I believe, in the midst of the pandemic. So good. Also impactful because June's book is a historical fiction, and it's set in the 1800s Korea. And the reason why it's so impactful is because when you think of historical fiction, it's traditionally like a World War II book. And I thought for a very long time I wasn't interested in historical fiction. And this book kind of reminded me, oh, history happened all over the world. So it's also it's so interesting to learn about Korea in the 1800s and like how in weird ways, like through patriarchy, was ultimately offering opportunities to women in a very roundabout ways. You had women, although indentured, were police officers, but they were police officers because men couldn't either touch the dead body of a woman. That was like a taboo. So you needed a woman there to investigate in that way, or like to enter like the inner sanctum of a home that is a woman's place in the home, and so they wouldn't be able to access that as men, so they would have a female cop there. It's interesting things like that that I learned quite a bit about Korea, so that's why I think is very impactful, widening the idea of historical fiction.
Okay, number 3.
This one's a fun one. This is honestly a personal favorite of mine. It is Ben Philippe's first book, The Field Guide to the North American Teenager, in which a Black teen who's French-Canadian moves to Texas. And hijinks ensue. It's a comedy. It's so funny.
I have to read that one again now that Eden's in school in the States. I feel like it'll be really funny in a different way.
Funny. It's so funny, and it's a book I bring up because I know when we started out, when I started at FOLD, one of the things we were talking about is more marginalized men, especially like Black men writing books who are Canadian in particular. So people like having someone like a Ben Philippe was really great because now you'll see, other people writing books like Chad Lucas or Kern Carter, Cody Dill. So, and it's also just a really fun book.
Awesome. Those are all FOLD Kids alum, so I love it. Thank you so much for those thoughts, for those words. All right. We're going to wrap this episode up. The next episode will be released in the next month or so. We don't really know. Everything's a bit of like we'll figure it out soon. Hopefully by the time this airs, we'll know more things. And so if you're looking for more information, you can follow us on our social media. We're on Instagram, we're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, at The Fold or Festival of Literary Diversity. Doesn't take much to find us. You can always go to thefoldcanada.org and find us there. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast feed so you'll know when the next episode drops. And you can also watch the video version on the Fold's YouTube channel.
And if you like the work that we do, if you like this podcast and you want to support us, you can leave a rating or a review on your podcast player of choice, and make sure you tell all of your friends to listen to us as well. And you can also donate to The Fold at thefoldcanada.org/donate.
So the Festival of Literary Diversity is a multimodal festival that will run in 2025 from April 27th to May 4th. You can join the festival from anywhere in the world, April 27th to 30th at our virtual events, and you can join us in person in Brampton, May 1st to the 4th. This episode is sponsored by Sheridan's Honors Bachelor of Creative Writing and Publishing program, a 4-year degree that prepares students for a career in both writing and publishing. Visit sheridancollege.ca for more information. See you next time on Into the Fold with Jael and Lin.